I didn't betray anyone. That's the part that took me years to understand. I kept my promises. I showed up. I stayed when it would have been easier to leave. From the outside, my life looked built on loyalty. People trusted me because I was consistent. Dependable. Predictable in the best possible way. I was the person who didn't disappear. Who didn't change suddenly. Who didn't break patterns. I wore that identity with pride. For a long time, I believed loyalty was my strongest trait. I didn't realize it was also my cage. It started early. I learned quickly that being needed made me valuable. That reliability earned love. That staying earned approval. So I stayed. I stayed in conversations that drained me. In roles that no longer fit. In situations that quietly asked me to sacrifice myself, politely. No one forced me. That's important. I chose it. Because loyalty felt like purpose. I told myself that walking away would mean hurting people. That choosing myself would be selfish. That discomfort was the price of being a good person. And maybe sometimes it is. But I didn't know when to stop paying. Over time, loyalty stopped being a choice. It became reflex. I said yes before checking in with myself. I absorbed tension instead of addressing it. I adjusted my boundaries until they were barely visible. People admired my patience. I called it strength. Inside, something else was happening. I felt stretched thin in ways I couldn't explain. Not tired, hollow. Like my energy was always going outward and never coming back. I started feeling resentment in places where I used to feel pride. Not loud resentment. Quiet. The kind you don't admit even to yourself. I told myself it meant I needed rest. Or perspective. Or gratitude. Anything but honesty. There was a moment, subtle, almost forgettable, when the imbalance became impossible to ignore. Someone thanked me for always being there. They meant it sincerely. I smiled. And suddenly, I felt an unexpected thought rise up: where am I? The question startled me. Because I didn't have an answer. I had been so focused on being present for everyone else that I hadn't noticed my own absence. I started paying attention to how my body reacted to situations I automatically accepted. Tight shoulders. Shallow breathing. A heaviness that appeared before I even said yes. My body knew before my mind did. I was overextended. Not because people demanded too much. Because I never demanded anything back. I realized that loyalty had become my identity. And identities are dangerous when they don't allow negotiation. I couldn't leave without feeling like I was betraying someone. I couldn't say no without rehearsing explanations. I couldn't choose differently without guilt. Guilt followed me everywhere. It disguised itself as responsibility. As morality. As maturity. But guilt is not the same as integrity. Integrity includes yourself. That was the truth I had been avoiding. I began to understand that I wasn't living a life guided by values. I was living a life guided by obligation. There's a difference. Values give you direction. Obligations give you weight. And I was carrying too much. I didn't feel entitled to complain. After all, nothing terrible was happening. People weren't cruel. Situations weren't abusive. They were just consuming. Slowly. Politely. Without resistance. That's what made it dangerous. I had confused being indispensable with being alive. And in doing so, I had made myself optional in my own life. I started asking myself a question that felt almost forbidden: what if loyalty to others has come at the cost of loyalty to myself? That question didn't accuse. It clarified. I saw patterns I hadn't allowed myself to see before. How often I stayed to avoid disappointing someone. How rarely I asked whether staying was honest. How easily I dismissed my own limits as inconvenience. I realized something painful. I wasn't afraid of hurting others. I was afraid of losing my identity as the reliable one. Who would I be if I stopped being the person everyone depended on? That thought scared me. Because it meant I might have to rebuild myself from something other than obligation. The idea felt unfamiliar. And heavy. But also, for the first time in a long while, true. I didn't yet know what change would look like. But I knew this much: loyalty had stopped being a virtue. It had become avoidance. And if I didn't learn the difference soon, would spend the rest of my life being faithful to everyone, except myself. Once I allowed myself to question my loyalty, everything became uncomfortable. Not externally. Internally. Situations I used to accept without thought suddenly felt heavy. Requests that once sounded reasonable now landed like quiet demands. Familiar obligations began to feel intrusive. Nothing had changed. Except me. That scared me. Because it meant the problem wasn't circumstances. It was consent. I had been consenting to everything without realizing it. I started noticing how often my decisions were driven by fear disguised as virtue. Fear of disappointing. Fear of being seen as selfish. Fear of disrupting the balance I had spent years maintaining. I told myself these fears made me considerate. In reality, they made me invisible. There was a growing tension inside me, a sense that I was living two conflicting truths at once. On one side was the version of me that believed loyalty defined my worth. On the other was a quieter voice asking why my own needs were always negotiable. That tension followed me everywhere. I felt it before agreeing to plans I didn't want. Before taking on responsibilities that drained me. Before staying silent when something felt wrong. I began to hesitate, and that hesitation felt like betrayal. Even thinking about choosing myself triggered guilt. Not situational guilt. Existential guilt. As if self-prioritization were a moral failure. I realized how deeply I had internalized the belief that being a good person meant being available. Always reachable. Always accommodating. Always stable. Stability had become my offering to the world. I gave it freely. At my expense. I noticed how my patience was praised while my exhaustion went unseen. How my reliability was admired while my boundaries were ignored, mostly because I never made them visible. People didn't cross my limits. I erased them. That realization hurt. Because it meant no one was taking advantage of me. I was volunteering. I was enforcing my own disappearance in the name of loyalty. The resentment I felt toward others softened into something more painful. Responsibility. I couldn't blame anyone for a dynamic I had helped create. That made change feel even harder. How do you renegotiate relationships when no one knows there was a problem? How do you say, "I can't do this anymore," when you've spent years saying, "It's fine"? I imagined what choosing myself would look like. It wasn't dramatic. It was awkward. Conversations I didn't know how to start. Explanations I didn't want to give. Discomfort I had spent my life avoiding. I feared being misunderstood. But more than that, I feared becoming unfamiliar. To others, and to myself. Loyalty had given me a clear identity. If I removed it, what would remain? I didn't feel brave enough to find out. So I delayed. I told myself this wasn't the right time. That people depended on me. That I could revisit this later. Later became my refuge. But later didn't ease the tension. It sharpened it. I started feeling the cost of staying physically. Headaches. Restlessness. A constant low-level fatigue that sleep didn't fix. My body was protesting a life my values were defending. There was a moment, quiet, unremarkable, when something inside me reached a breaking point. I was asked for something small. A favor. An expectation. Another extension of myself. I opened my mouth to say yes. And nothing came out. Not because I wanted to say no, but because I couldn't say yes anymore without lying. The silence stretched. I felt panic rise. In that pause, I understood something crucial. Loyalty that requires self-erasure is not integrity. It's self-abandonment. I finally saw the pattern clearly. Every time I chose others at my own expense, I felt morally superior, and personally diminished. Every time I honored my commitments without honoring myself, I felt dependable, and resentful. That contradiction was unsustainable. I realized that if I continued like this, my life wouldn't implode. It would calcify. I would become reliable and bitter. Present and absent. Praised and empty. That image terrified me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was likely. I began to understand that loyalty isn't proven by how much you sacrifice. It's proven by how honestly you choose. And I hadn't been choosing. I had been defaulting. The moral dilemma crystallized sharply. If I continued being loyal to everyone else, would slowly lose the ability to recognize myself. If I chose myself, would disrupt relationships built on my availability. Both paths involved loss. But only one involved survival. I didn't know yet how to change without becoming someone I didn't recognize. But I knew one thing with clarity that hurt. Being loyal to everyone had become a way of avoiding the risk of living my own life. And that avoidance was no longer neutral. It was destructive. The question was no longer whether I could keep being loyal. I could. The question was whether I was willing to disappear completely in order to do so. Choosing myself didn't feel like freedom. It felt like betrayal. Not of others, of the version of me that believed loyalty was the highest virtue. For years, that belief had guided every decision. It told me who I was. What I was worth. Why I belonged. Letting it go felt like stepping outside of my own moral framework. The first "no" I said out loud stayed with me for days. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't defiant. It was quiet. Unsteady. And it came with immediate guilt. I replayed it in my head, searching for cruelty I might have missed. For selfishness hidden in the tone. But there was none. Just honesty. The world didn't collapse. No one accused me of being heartless. Nothing catastrophic happened. And that confused me. Because inside, everything felt different. The guilt didn't disappear right away. It lingered, not because I had done something wrong, but because I had violated a rule I had never questioned before. The rule that said, your needs come last. Breaking that rule felt dangerous. But staying loyal to it had become unbearable. I began to notice something subtle as I continued. Each time I chose myself, even clumsily, I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear of disappointing. Relief of no longer lying. I learned quickly that choosing yourself doesn't make life easier. It makes it clearer. Some relationships shifted. Some expectations dissolved. Some people struggled with the change. Not because I became cruel, but because I became unavailable in ways they weren't used to. That hurt. I had to grieve the version of myself that existed to support everyone else. Not because that version was false, but because it was unsustainable. I realized how many connections had been built on my compliance rather than my presence. Those connections didn't survive the change. Others did, stronger, quieter, more honest. I learned something important in that process. Boundaries don't destroy relationships. They reveal which ones were real. The more I honored myself, the more I noticed my internal world stabilizing. Not in a dramatic way. In a grounded way. I stopped waking up already depleted. I stopped feeling resentment for things I had agreed to. I stopped needing constant validation to justify my exhaustion. For the first time, my energy felt like it belonged to me. I was still loyal. Just not blindly. I became loyal to my limits. To my body's signals. To the quiet truth that had been asking for space for years. That loyalty felt unfamiliar. And deeply right. I learned that integrity isn't about sacrifice alone. It's about alignment. You can be generous and still be honest. You can be kind and still say no. You can care deeply without disappearing. Those things aren't opposites. They only seem that way when you've been trained to believe your worth depends on how much you give up. I still feel guilt sometimes. Old habits don't vanish overnight. But now I recognize guilt for what it is, a residue of a life lived on obligation instead of choice. I don't obey it automatically anymore. I question it. If you're listening to this and you feel torn between loyalty and self-preservation, I want you to hear this clearly. Loyalty that requires you to abandon yourself is not virtue. It's fear wearing a moral mask. You are not selfish for needing space. You are not cruel for having limits. You are not broken for wanting a life that includes you. I didn't become less dependable when I chose myself. I became more real. And real presence is worth more than endless availability. My life didn't suddenly become simple. But it became inhabitable. I no longer feel like I'm living for everyone else and borrowing moments for myself. I am here. Choosing. Participating. Present. And the strange thing is, the more loyal I became to myself, the less I needed approval to know who I was. That is the kind of loyalty that doesn't ask you to disappear. It asks you to stay. And staying, fully, honestly, imperfectly, is the first true commitment I have ever made.